This is OPPO's newest foldable, the Find N3, and on paper at least, it has the best cameras that you'll find on any foldable device right now. It comes with an ultra premium triple camera system, including what OPPO claims is one of the best periscope telephoto lenses on the market. It has a high resolution 48 megapixel ultra wide lens. Plus, on top of that, the main lens uses this brand new stacked pixel architecture CMOS sensor, allowing it to produce results similar to that of a 1-inch sensor without actually taking up the space of an actual 1-inch sensor. In fact, OPPO is so confident with this camera system that they reckon it's not only one of the best lineup of cameras that you'll find on a foldable device, but that it actually competes with the very best cameras on any smartphone, period. And whilst it's one thing to make such lofty claims, it's another altogether to actually put it up against the competition, which is exactly what I'm going to do in this video. And whilst this video is sponsored by OPPO, that hasn't stopped me from going out and capturing over 750 photos and videos with the Find N3 and the Galaxy Z Fold 5. And sponsored or not, I will be giving you my honest opinions of the images and videos from these devices throughout this video. And even if you think OPPO sponsoring this video makes it impossible for me to be unbiased, then hopefully the photos and videos will do all of the talking anyway, and you can just make up your own mind if you like. So kicking things off with the main cameras, and as mentioned, the OPPO Find N3 here is using the first ever stacked pixel architecture CMOS sensor on any foldable device, which essentially means that each pixel's elements are divided across 2 layers, which is how it's able to produce those 1-inch sensor results that I mentioned earlier, while still fitting in this slim foldable form factor. It's also a 48 megapixel sensor, and then the lens itself has an aperture of f1.7. The Galaxy Z Fold 5, on the other hand, it's utilizing a 50 megapixel sensor with an aperture of f1.8 for its main camera. But bear in mind, this is actually the exact same sensor that we've seen on all of their foldable devices, dating all the way back to the Galaxy Fold 2. Now, if we start by looking at a range of photos taken in daytime conditions, this is where you'll probably notice the least amount of difference in terms of quality, as both phones are able to capture fantastic results in these sorts of conditions, as do most phones these days, let's be honest. But how much you like the final results will probably differ depending on personal preference. That being said, on an objective level, images from the OPPO phone do tend to look more natural and less over-sharpened, and they also tend to have a warmer color palette compared to the cooler tones of the images taken on the Galaxy Fold 5. Images from the Fold 5 also tend to be a bit more contrasty and oversaturated compared to the slightly more neutral images from the Find N3, but I don't think either approach is necessarily better than the other here. And as I said, whichever one you like the most will again most likely come down to personal preference. If we take a look at some portrait images taken using the main lenses as well, you can see that both phones do a really impressive job here, with both performing quite well in terms of edge detection, and both phones also do a great job in terms of producing a fairly natural fall off in terms of background blur. Then taking a look at low light images from the main cameras, and again, similar to the images taken in bright conditions, Samsung tends to push its night mode shots a little bit further, opting to make the entire image brighter and more vibrant, and that often results in more noise being visible in what are meant to be those darker areas of the image, whereas the OPPO is more willing to let those darker areas get crushed, which results in less grain and therefore cleaner end results. Again, some may prefer the brighter look from Samsung's night mode images, but if you're wanting the better quality and more realistic images overall, then the Find N3 takes the cake here. I will also add, because of that larger sensor, even though I forced night mode on for both phones, the OPPO phone was actually able to take many of these shots without any delay after tapping that shutter button at all, whereas for every single low light shot captured on the Z Fold 5, it took at least 3 seconds, sometimes even 5 seconds or more, to capture the shots. In terms of video with the main lenses, both lenses offer optical image stabilization and can record in 4K 60, though the Fold 5 can also go as high as 8K 30. And I know that there are definitely some who really appreciate those extra pixels, so that's something to keep in mind. However, in terms of actual image quality, this time around, I'd actually say that the video captured on the Find N3 is more saturated, whereas the video from the Fold 5 is actually a little more natural looking. That being said, the OPPO's video has quite a bit better dynamic range, with more detail being preserved in those darker and brighter areas. And in terms of capturing videos at night, where software trickery is much harder to pull off well, because of that larger sensor, the OPPO phone clearly outperforms the Samsung phone here, with videos just being generally brighter, yet with less noise. Alright, moving on to the ultra-wide cameras now, and in terms of hardware, whilst the OPPO phone is using a larger 48 megapixel half-inch sensor compared to the 12 megapixel 1 in 3.06 inch size sensor found on the Fold 5, the Fold 5's ultra-wide does have a wider field of view of 123 degrees or 12mm full frame equivalent compared to the 114 degree field of view or 14mm full frame equivalent on the Find N3. And so again, looking at daytime images, whilst you definitely get better quality results from the Find N3, you do get that wider field of view with the Fold 5, which I know some people will prefer. But like I said, in terms of image quality, the OPPO's ultra-wide definitely outperforms the Samsung's. We have far better dynamic range, images are a lot cleaner in terms of noise performance, and honestly, even in bright conditions, if there's even just a little bit of darkness anywhere in the image, shots taken using the Samsung phone's ultra-wide lens, they do tend to start falling apart. And so, possibly as expected, if we compare results captured in low light conditions with the ultra-wide lenses, even with night mode turned on, the difference in quality between the two phones becomes even further. Like, shots from the Fold 5 are certainly passable for just posting to social media, but there's only so much that software processing can do, given it's using a much smaller sensor. And on the other hand, that ultra-wide lens on the OPPO phone is just able to produce much cleaner, more natural looking images in low light with far better color correction and less noise overall as well. Switching to video with the ultra-wide lenses, and this time around, whilst the Fold 5 can record in up to 4K 30, the Find N3 is actually able to maintain that 4K resolution whilst recording at up to 60 frames a second. Again, you do get that wider field of view with the Fold 5, which is really nice to have, but as we saw with pictures from these lenses, in terms of overall image quality, OPPO's results look a lot cleaner with better dynamic range. Real quick, taking a look at the selfie camera situation, and I'm not going to spend too much time here because whilst both phones do have selfie cameras on both the inner and cover displays, I only think that they're largely of use for video calls and the like, because one of the big perks of using a foldable device is that you can actually use the rear cameras to capture outrageously high quality selfies. In case you are interested though, the OPPO phone uses a 20 megapixel f2.2 hole punch shooter for the inner display, whereas the Fold 5 utilizes a 4 megapixel f1.8 under display camera. And look, it's cool and all that Samsung's is somewhat hidden under the display, although you can definitely still see it. But in terms of image quality, despite some impressive software processing on Samsung's part, it still ain't putting up any sort of fight against the much superior hole punch camera that we have on the Find N3. And then on top of that, in terms of video, the Galaxy Fold 5's inner display selfie camera can only shoot at 1080p, whereas the Find N3's inner display selfie camera, it can shoot at 4K 30. On the cover display, the Find N3 switches to a 32 megapixel f2.4 shooter with a 22mm full frame equivalent field of view, whereas the Fold 5 uses a 10 megapixel f2.2 shooter, and it's also a hole punch camera this time around, which greatly helps with image quality. But this one has a 24mm full frame equivalent field of view, and its sensor is actually ever so slightly bigger than the Find N3's cover display sensor. Results from these lenses are a little closer now, with images from the Samsung phone having a slightly flatter look to them compared to the more contrasty and vibrant results from the Find N3. But like I said, I only really think that these selfie cameras will be used for video calls. And in that case, all I really care about is field of view. And in that department, both of the Find N3 selfie cameras take the cake. And so finally, we have the telephoto cameras. And I saved this one for last because this is where I think that the OPPO Find N3 truly shines. Now, even though I use the term telephoto here, that's actually not quite the right term to use for the OPPO device. You see, whilst the Samsung phone uses a pretty standard 10 megapixel telephoto lens with OIS support and an aperture of f2.4, the OPPO is actually using a periscope lens to achieve that same 3x optical zoom. It's also using a larger 64 megapixel half-inch sensor, whereas the Samsung uses a smaller 1 in 3.94 inch sensor, and then it also has OIS support and a slightly lower aperture than the Fold 5's telephoto lens of f2.6. And for daytime shots at that 3x field of view, the results are actually very similar to those from the main lens, where images look slightly warmer and more natural from the Find N3 compared to the more contrasty, cooler images from the Fold 5. The 3x lens on the Find N3 is also a bit tighter compared to the slightly wider field of view from the Fold 5's telephoto lens, but as far as I'm concerned, that's definitely a good thing from the OPPO's point of view because I want that extra range from my telephoto lens. But then, thanks to that larger 64 megapixel sensor, the OPPO phone is actually able to losslessly zoom into a 6x field of view compared to the digital zoom equivalent from the Fold 5, and this allows it to preserve quite a bit more detail. Both phones can then take their digital zooms even further, and if we look at the results from 10x, 20x, and 30x digital zoom ranges, that preserved detail and those cleaner results from the Find N3, they're only further emphasized. And whilst 30x is the max zoom range of the Fold 5, the Find N3 is able to digitally zoom in all the way to 120x, though admittedly the results do get fairly mushy when using that amount of zoom, but it's still nice to have the option nonetheless. In terms of low light shots, both phones are able to pull out some really impressive shots with their respective 3x lenses. And I will say the Fold 5 does seem to handle the highlights in these shots a little better than the more blown out highlights of the Find N3, which was a little surprising. That being said, the Fold 5 shots do tend to be a little more over-sharpened, though I will admit, particularly with YouTube's compression, that's pretty hard to pick up on at this field of view unless you really pixel peep here. However, if we punch into a 6x shot with both phones, you'll see that the results from the Find N3 are now leagues above those from the Fold 5, thanks to the fact that we are cropping into that sensor rather than using digital zoom like what the Fold 5 is doing. Then if we punch into 10x, the image from the OPPO phone is still very usable and quite clean in my opinion, whereas things are really starting to fall apart here with the Fold 5. And 10x is actually where the Fold 5 stops us. We can't actually digitally zoom in any further when night mode is activated, but just for comparison's sake, if we push the Find N3 to 30x, whilst I wouldn't really be thinking about sharing this image online anymore, the result is actually still very passable and more than that, really impressive. Real quick, taking a look at some portrait images captured with both phones' respective 3x lenses, and I think both the OPPO and Samsung are doing a pretty great job here with really solid edge detection and fairly natural looking background blur. And OPPO actually told me that natural looking portrait shots were one of the key reasons that they chose to stick with a 3x lens as opposed to something like a 5x or 10x lens. This 3x field of view is just about the perfect field of view for portrait style shots because it means you get a really solid amount of lens compression, which offers a more flattering look for your subject, but it also means that you don't have to be super far away from your subject when taking the shot. And that, in combination with the Hasselblad tuning, which for portrait style shots emulates a really nice looking bokeh effect of a fast Hasselblad telephoto lens, it really does produce fantastic end results. The Samsung shots don't look too bad themselves either, to be fair, but they do look ever so slightly more processed compared to the more natural looking shots from the Find N3. Switching to video now, and both phones can capture 4K 60 with their respective zoom lenses. However, the Find N3 does crop in a bit when you shoot in this format, resulting in a slightly different field of view compared to the wider shot from the Fold 5. In terms of video quality though, once again, the image from the Find N3 is way cleaner and more natural looking with better dynamic range, which becomes really evident whenever shooting a person in particular. And compared to the Find N3, videos like this start to even look borderline out of focus on the Fold 5, given how overly processed they are with way too much noise removal applied, not to mention the worst dynamic range as well. I mean, by golly, these videos from the Find N3 are so impressive to me. I mean, it's not even really close in this category. I will say though, stabilization is definitely an area that I think the Samsung phone really shines in. And whilst the difference is quite subtle with the other lenses, I reckon it's pretty evident here when shooting with the telephoto lenses, where shots are very clean and well stabilized with the Galaxy Fold 5 and a little less so with the Find N3. Shooting telephoto videos in low light with both phones though, and whilst the stabilization is definitely better from the Fold 5 when shooting handheld, where the Find N3's looks quite jerky in comparison to the still impressively smooth stabilization from the Fold 5, the image quality is completely the other way around, where noise from the Fold 5's telephoto lens is super blotchy and really evident. And in some scenarios, it even looks like the Fold 5 has completely refused to switch to the telephoto lens and is just using the main camera digitally zoomed in, resulting in honestly pretty awful quality compared to the far superior quality from the Find N3's periscope lens. Real quick, it wouldn't be a complete camera comparison without at least comparing what the audio quality sounds like when shooting video. So here's a very brief comparison when shooting with the main lenses, and here's a very quick comparison when shooting with the ultra-wide lenses. And finally, the cover display selfie cameras. And to be honest, those are really the only 3 lenses that you're going to be interested in comparing the audio from. And so there you have it. That is the cameras on the OPPO Find N3 stacked up against the Galaxy Z Fold 5. And whilst Samsung might have 1 or 2 areas that are better than the Find N3, like stabilization, having a wider field of view with the ultra-wide lens, and being able to shoot in 8K with the main lens, I think aside from those areas, sponsored or not, there's no doubt in my mind that the overall camera experience is far superior on the OPPO Find N3. And that's not to mention that aside from the cameras, this phone also has a far superior hinge, which allows for a much less noticeable crease. There's also the larger battery, the faster charging, the much brighter inner and outer displays, plus, as far as I'm concerned, the better form factor overall. And when you add all of those aspects to the incredible camera experience, it makes the Find N3 almost unbeatable in terms of the foldable market. The only thing it's lacking in comparison to the Fold 5 is wireless charging, so hopefully we see that added in the next version of this device. But as far as I'm concerned, OPPO, alongside their sister company OnePlus, they are well and truly leading the pack here in terms of foldables, and every other company in this foldable market has some serious catching up to do.